There is a country whose national identity was built on the story of two ancestors meeting the Spanish colonizer and the indigenous American, fused into a single word, mestizo, taught in every school book, printed on every mural, sung in every anthem of national pride. For nearly 200 years, that was the entire story of who Mexico is. And for nearly 200 years, it left out a third ancestor whose presence in the genome never went away, even after the nation spent 2 centuries pretending it wasn't there. Walk along the Costa Chica, the stretch of Pacific coastline running through Oaxaca and Guerrero, or through the river towns of Veracruz, and you will find communities where the population looks unmistakably African deep brown skin, tightly coiled hair, facial features that trace directly back to West and Central Africa. Local tradition here has never needed convincing. These communities have told their own history for centuries. Descendants of enslaved Africans who were brought to New Spain, who resisted, who in some cases escaped into the hills and built free settlements before slavery in the rest of the hemisphere had even been seriously questioned. Nobody in Coajinicuilapa or in the fishing towns near Pinotepa Nacional needed a DNA test to know where they came from. The question was never whether this history existed. The question was why the rest of the country acted like it didn't. If you want an early answer to that question, subscribe now. Because the communities you're about to see are only the beginning of a much larger series uncovering the African diaspora stories no one else is telling. And every episode after this one adds another missing piece to a picture most viewers have never seen assembled in one place. Here is what the official record actually says, once you go looking for it. Beginning in the 16th century, Mexico received one of the largest forced African populations anywhere in the early Americas. Historians estimate that before 1600, more enslaved Africans had been brought into Mexico than into any other territory in the New World, arriving mainly from West Africa's Guinea coast, from Cape Verde, and from Central African Bantu-speaking regions further south. Some resisted immediately and violently. The most famous case is Gaspar Yanga, a man believed to have been of Gabonese royal descent, who led an uprising in the mountains of Veracruz in the late 1500s, and after decades of guerrilla resistance, the Spanish crown could not suppress, forced colonial authorities into a treaty in 1618, recognizing his settlement, San Lorenzo de los Negros, as a free town, one of the first free African settlements anywhere in the Americas, more than 2 centuries before Haiti's revolution, and nearly 250 years before the end of slavery in the United States. So, the record exists. The town still exists, renamed Yanga in his honor, recognized in 2017 by UNESCO's Slave Route Project as a site of memory. The demographic weight of that history should, by any reasonable expectation, sit near the center of how Mexico understands itself. Instead, for most of the 20th century, it barely appeared in the national story at all. The disturbing question this raises is not really historical, it's structural. If the demographic and historical record of African presence in Mexico is this substantial, this early, and this well documented, why does the population genetics of an average Mexican rarely, if ever, come framed in African terms? Why did generations of Mexican schoolchildren learn about the Spanish and indigenous roots of their nation in exhaustive, celebrated detail, while the third root barely earned a footnote? Population genetics did not invent an answer to that question so much as confirm one that Afro-Mexican communities had been living inside for centuries. Genome-wide studies conducted over the past 2 decades, including ongoing work through the Afro-Mexico Genomics Project at Mexico's National Autonomous University, have found that the average Mexican carries a measurable sub-Saharan African genetic component, typically cited around 5% nationally, rising dramatically higher in the specific coastal communities of Oaxaca, Guerrero, and Veracruz, where African ancestry was never fully diluted by the same mixing patterns that shaped the rest of the country. In other words, the African genetic signature in Mexico isn't a rare anomaly requiring rediscovery. It is a baseline feature of the national genome, present in nearly everyone, concentrated intensely in specific places, and almost entirely absent from the national conversation about identity. Here is where the genetic story takes its sharpest and most unusual turn. the one that separates the Afro-Mexican case from nearly every other diaspora population this channel has covered. In most African diaspora communities, genetic ancestry tends to sort cleanly enough that people can be described as predominantly African, predominantly indigenous, or a defined mixture measured against those poles. Afro-Mexican identity doesn't sort that cleanly at all. According to Mexico's 2015 intercensal survey, nearly 65% of people who self-identified as Afro-Mexican also identified simultaneously as indigenous, and close to 10% of them spoke an indigenous language as well as Spanish. This is not a population split into separate African and indigenous branches living near each other. This is a population where those two identities routinely live inside the same individual, inherited together, spoken together, carried together for generations, in a way that resists the tidy ancestry categories used almost everywhere else in the hemisphere. The genome adds an even stranger layer to this. Researchers studying the human leukocyte antigen region, part of the immune system's genetic architecture, found that Mexican populations show unusually strong evidence of natural selection, favoring African-derived genetic variants in this region. Since the colonial era admixture began a selection signal strong enough that geneticists have placed it among the most powerful examples of recent human adaptation ever measured, in the same statistical range as lactose tolerance in Northern Europeans or resistance to malaria through the sickle cell trait in parts of Africa. This means the African genetic contribution to Mexico was not simply present and diluted over centuries. In at least one critical region of the genome, it was actively selected for, favored by evolution itself, because it offered a measurable survival advantage to the mixed population that carried it. If you're wondering how a genetic signature this strong, this old, and this biologically significant stayed so far outside the national story for so long, you're asking exactly the right question, and it's one this channel keeps finding answered the same disappointing way across different countries and different centuries, not by absence of evidence, but by absence of will to look at it. That pattern, and how differently it resolves in each population we cover, is exactly why it's worth turning on notifications for what comes next. The disappearance was not accidental. Mexican nation building in the 19th and 20th centuries deliberately constructed the mestizo identity as the foundation of a unified post-colonial nation, a narrative that had real political utility. It offered a single, cohesive story of belonging after independence and revolution, one built explicitly around the fusion of Spanish and indigenous roots. Africans did not fit that formula, and rather than expanding it, the national narrative simply left them out. Colonial-era ethnic categories that once tracked African ancestry in official records faded from use. Africans and their descendants were absorbed, administratively and rhetorically, into the broader mestizo population, their specific heritage erased from the census, from textbooks, and eventually from most Mexicans' understanding of their own country's demographic history. It took organized, sustained pressure from Afro-Mexican communities themselves to reverse that erasure, and the timeline is more recent than most people would guess. The Mexican government's Third Root program, launched in 1989, was the first sustained state-level acknowledgement that the nation's ethnic makeup included an African dimension worth studying and teaching. Even then, formal constitutional recognition took another 3 decades. It was not until 2019 that the Mexican Congress amended Article 2 of the National Constitution to explicitly recognize Afro-Mexican peoples, granting them legal standing similar to what had already been extended to indigenous communities generations earlier. Mexico's first census permitting people to self-identify as Afro-Mexican, Afro-descendant, or Black did not happen until 2020. For context, roughly 1.4 million people identified this way in the 2015 intercensal count that preceded formal recognition, a population larger than several entire countries, invisible in the constitution of the nation they were born into, until the year before a global pandemic began. What this means for Afro-Mexican communities today is a strange kind of vindication arriving on 2 different timelines at once. The genetic record has, in a sense, always been available, encoded in every generation since the 16th century, sitting quietly in the same DNA that carries eye color and blood type, indifferent to whether the nation built around it chose to acknowledge it. The political and legal record moved far slower, shaped by decisions made in the 19th century that took until 2019 to formally unwind. For a Costa Chica fisherman whose community has never doubted its own history for a single generation, the DNA results and the constitutional amendment are both, in their own way, catching up to something that was never actually lost. It was simply not being looked at by the people with the power to write it down. There is a comparative point worth making here, because it shows how differently the same underlying history can be handled by neighboring nations facing nearly identical circumstances. Colombia, Brazil, and several other Latin American countries recognized Afro-descendant populations in their constitutions decades before Mexico did. Some as early as the late 1980s and early 1990s, during the same wave of multicultural constitutional reforms that swept the region. Mexico and Chile were the last two major Latin American nations to hold out. Both had built founding national narratives that left little conceptual room for a third route, and both delayed recognition for a generation longer than their neighbors, even as their own population genetics told a story that had never actually changed. The lesson isn't that Mexico's history was unusual. It's that the political decision to acknowledge a history is almost always separate from the biological fact of that history existing, and the gap between the two can last for generations if nobody with power has an incentive to close it. Stand today in Yanga, the town named for the man who forced a treaty out of the Spanish crown 4 centuries ago, and you are standing in a place where two timelines finally meet. The genetic evidence of Africa never disappeared from this soil. What disappeared for 200 years was the nation's willingness to say so out loud. The Third Root Program, the 2019 Constitutional Amendment, the 2020 Census Category, the ongoing genome sequencing work at UNAM, these are not discoveries in the way a shipwreck or a hidden gene flow pattern is a discovery. They are corrections, a slow, overdue act of national arithmetic, finally adding a third number that had been there in the sum all along. There's a broader question worth sitting with as this series continues, and it's the same one that will keep coming up in every population we cover from here forward. How much of what we call national identity is really just an agreement made by people in power about which ancestors are allowed to count? If you want to keep tracing that question across the different corners of the world where it plays out differently every time, this is the moment to hit subscribe, because the next story picks up exactly where this one leaves off, in a place where the erasure went even further and the DNA had to work even harder to be heard. Mexico's mestizo story was never false. Spanish and indigenous ancestry really do sit at the center of who most Mexicans are. But a story can be true and still be incomplete. And for 2 centuries, incompleteness was treated as the whole truth. The genome never agreed to that arrangement. It kept the third root alive in blood type, in immune system selection, in the faces of Costa Chica fishing towns that never needed a laboratory to tell them who they were. The laboratory and the Constitution are only now catching up to what those towns already knew.